talk today will be delivered by Dr. Ken Fowler from the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Manitoba. He is also the Faculty of Arts Social Science Research Professor. Dr. Fowler's talk is entitled Deep History of the Gendered Division of Labor, and this is a talk that's based on his new research using fingerprints to study ancient economies, which should be enormously interesting. So before we get started, and before I hand it off to Dr. Fowler, I want to let everyone know that we will be recording this talk and posting it on our YouTube channel. So you're welcome to turn your camera off if you want to. We won't be recording or posting the questions once we get to those. So feel free to turn your camera back on then if you'd like. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Fowler. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thanks a lot, Royce. Let me just fire this up here. Okay, everyone can see that, can they? That's my title slide. Can you see it, Royce?
Yep.
You're the only face I can see, so we'll start with that. Yeah, before we begin, I just want to thank Royce for the opportunity to present today on what is certainly a topic with a rich history of discussion within and outside the social sciences and humanities, but one that becomes increasingly fraught and hazardous to understand the further back we reach into humanity's past. I think it's fair to say that cultural conceptions of gender have long been viewed as an organizing principle for the division of labor and the division of work in human societies. There's many assumptions about task segregation. Most of these have their roots in 19th century thinking about the nature and social value of gender differences in competencies and traits. And if not explicit, labor divisions were cast in thinly veiled assumptions about the physical and cognitive abilities and universal social demands thought to distinguish at a minimum men and women. For instance, men perform dangerous and life-threatening activities while women are responsible for the domestic and child care in this kind of what has been called a cult of domesticity. Such premises were historically taken for granted in theories to understand the history of labor and compensation, definitely in the Western world, and influenced ideas such as the allocation of time and comparable worth. In reaction to all of this, anthropologists dismantled the notion that tasks were not fixed to sex or genders cross-culturally and thus not based in biology. And more broadly, much social science research has come to more recently focus on the way cultural beliefs and values and attitudes about gender and structural roles shape interactions that perpetuate or undermine this perception of norms about gender divisions of labor and inequality. Now, when we examine the deep history of gender and labor, this requires very different kinds of methods and evidence. If we, for instance, if we want to study the history of the division of labor, like most other historical inquiries, we start with relying on four primary sources of data or information: observational or interactive, textual, oral historical, and pictographic. And as we move further and further back in time, we are able to draw on each of these sources less and less because it's not possible to draw on them, like we can't observe past societies. The evidence doesn't exist, like textual or pictographic evidence, or they just don't inform us about what we're interested in learning about. And you know, this can be textual evidence, pictographic, or oral historical evidence. It's just vague, ambiguous, or silent on certain things that we want to understand. So at this point, we must then extend our data sources to all the material traces of past human behavior. And then we are relying on two of anthropology's subdisciplines, archaeology and biological anthropology. Now, archaeologists have taken many different approaches to understanding how women and men and other potential genders came to be practically and ideologically associated with certain tasks and activities. Most have relied on ethnographic and historical models, what we refer to as the ethnographic present, to infer labor divisions in making tools and conducting subsistence activities and all kinds of other things, which kind of treats the present as a template for the past. This approach makes use of analogy, which takes empirical regularities in ethnographic and historical records to create a model for reality. And then that's tested against the material record of behavior in the past, which results in something that may be called a model for reality at that time. So just to give you a recent example, Randall Hassan and his colleagues have used this approach to study hunting 9,000 years ago in the Andes. And as they say, the sexual division of labor with females as gatherers and males as hunters is a major empirical regularity of hunter-gatherer ethnography, suggesting a behavioral pattern, an ancestral behavioral pattern. So in contrast to this expectation, they found hunting toolkits of stone projectile points and animal processing tools in the burial of one young female. And this kind of assemblage was consistent with male burials who were thought to be primarily the hunters. So they concluded that this must reflect a reality of non-gendered labor practices in which early hunter-gatherer females were also big game hunters. In a similar kind of way, in much the same manner, archaeologists elsewhere have associated the function of objects deposited in the graves of men and women, and this is organized by sex and not gender, so males and females, to begin to infer the tasks that these people undertook during life. Now, it's one thing here that I show you on the left side to notice regularities in the treatment of the dead that align or correspond regularly with the sex of the individual in the grave. It's quite another thing to infer from that labor segregation practices in a living society based upon what the living afforded the dead in a mortuary ritual, translating this regularity and association of things with people and then transforming that yet again into men, women, and children do these activities and are associated with these tools. So this approach presents one of the most major pitfalls in archaeology. And we must guard against what has been called the tyranny of the ethnographic record. This is where we take empirical regularities in our collective understanding of human behavior. We cannot hold those up as the only possible realities, the only ways of doing things in past societies, because this winnows the potential diversity of human thinking and behavior in the past. Because it puts us in a position where we're tied into this kind of feedback loop that's founded in assumptions about task segregation, the nature and social value of gender differences in competencies and traits, and the physical and cognitive abilities and universal social demands that are thought to distinguish at a minimum men and women. So this particular approach and way of thinking has had a tremendous impact on my area of research interest, which is the economics of craft production. It's caused tremendous confusion sometimes. First of all, in equating sex and gender, on the one hand, there's confusing myriad things going on in the literature about this, and arguments that there is some kind of intrinsic division of labor in craft economies on the other hand, when we know there's nothing intrinsic about it. So you go into the literature and you find something like this. It's like there's crafts. Most ethnographic cultures around the world are practiced by a specific gender. No support for that. Then you turn around and you find the same person going, sex specificity is not intrinsic to the making and using of things. And then in the following sentence, because the sexual division of labor is intrinsic to most crafts. It's just a wildly confusing set of thoughts that don't follow from the other. So at the same time, it's actually quite easy to become biased to think that there is a sexually based division of labor intrinsic in most societies if we look at the world around us. You know, for me working in Africa, it's quite evident that women are usually potters in most African cultures today and in the very recent past. But what if we expand beyond that? What if we go out and we take a look at the entire world? Okay, well, let's do that. We'll start with a simple question. The question is, who were ancient potters? Well, to give us some kind of baseline to think about this, we can just take a random sample of cultures around the world documented over the past century. We can exclude the ones where pottery is not or no longer produced. And we can end up reaching the same conclusion that those who rely on hunter-gatherer ethnography do. The division of labor with females as exclusive potters is a major empirical regularity ethnographically, and this would suggest an ancestral behavioral pattern, just like those of our colleagues working on hunter-gatherer hunting practices. Well, the problem is, how do you actually identify who made this? So I'm going to spend the rest of my time here, having fronted this quite lengthy. The only direct form of evidence for who manufactured objects in ancient communities. And this comes in the form of finger and handprints, palm prints, left on clay objects. And I want to discuss the potential for rethinking the history of labor divisions and even knowledge transmission within and between generations. This evidence challenges, I think, the fundamental notion that entire tasks or entire activities were actually segregated by sex or gender or age, for that matter. So what I'm trying to do here is connect two things. I'm trying to connect ceramic objects and epidermal prints. So just quickly, what are we thinking about when we talk about ceramics? Well, the use of clay itself probably has an extraordinarily long history in human societies, but clay objects subjected to heat, this transforms them into durable ceramic objects. It's still pretty old stuff. So initially we see figurines dating to about 30,000 years ago, and about 20,000 years ago we have the first containers. But pottery technology was invented independently around the world at different times and in different places. So the ceramic record, at least, can take us back some 1,200 generations into the past. And if we go all the way back to those 1,200 generations, this is the time where we see figurative art emerge in the world. Burials in cemeteries becomes prevalent. This is the time for dog lovers where we have the first domestication of dogs. And we have our first long-distance exchange networks. And this varies depending where we look in the world. So even the earliest figurines that we have, look at that, they do have fingerprints on them. So this record can take us deeply, deeply into the past. Now, based on what we know about how ceramic objects are made, there are only a few moments during the manufacture of these things when prints can actually be impressed on objects and potentially preserve. In all the potential stages of making a thing, The first stage is when objects are shaped into their final form, right? And the clay is still wet or at least manipulable. It's not dry. The second is when people elaborate the appearance of that object in some way. We call this decoration stage. So it's still not dry yet. And the third potential time is after these objects are fired. And this is when people may choose to modify the surface again. They may glaze them, they may plaster them, do other kinds of things. And on that new surface, you can have prints be impressed and accrue. So that's the pottery side of things. The print side of things, when we're talking about epidermal prints, what we're referring to is the friction ridge skin on our hands and our feet. It doesn't occur anywhere else. And when we're looking at ancient prints on objects, what we're usually seeing is ridges from fingertips or parts of the palm when we're looking at ceramic objects, because this is how we manipulate the clay. So we can, narrow things down to we're really only dealing with fingers and maybe certain parts of the hand, okay? Because we have a fairly good understanding about how this stuff is made. So when we're looking at prints, we're looking at two features of epidermal prints that are of interest, and we're using these to infer age and sex. The first feature we're looking at is the breadth of the ridge, so how wide each of the little ridges is. The second is how many ridges occur in some kind of standardized sort of area. So it's those two things that we're looking at. We identify them and we measure them. Now, to make these measurements, we use a variety of different imaging techniques and measurement software that was originally designed for cell biology research, but we're applying them here to something different. And you can see here quite nicely, these prints pop up pretty clearly either on an object, on a mold of an object, or we can use more fancy kind of imaging techniques like reflectance transformation imaging to make them super clear. So we've got this, we can make our measurements. Now, interpreting our measurements is a different matter. And to do that, we rely on a vast forensic literature that's associated ridge breadth with age and ridge density with biological sex. So what ridge breadth allows us to do is distinguish children from adults and adolescents. However, there's a few problems in here. Because of the variable onset of puberty, which can range anywhere depending on the population from 17 to 14 years of age, because fingers stop growing around 15 years of age, and because finger ridge breadth can increase in width and thickness due to chronic resistance from intensive repetitive activities like potting, we can only really securely distinguish children from some adults and adolescents. So it's not super refined yet, but we've got at least three groups we can put them in. What ridge density does is allow us to distinguish between males and females. But mean ridge density values, every population that's ever been studied forensically, males always have fewer ridges and females always have more ridges in this little area, but there's a little overlap zone, right? So it will overlap. The specific values that distinguish males and females also does vary by population. So ridge thickness and density, just like other physical and biological traits that are more prevalent in some populations than others, these result from the history of genetic drift and gene flow in populations. So some things become fixed, and these are one of the things that vary. So for instance, we must then compare ancient prints with information that we have from modern populations that have the closest shared biological history. And with that, we are heavily relying on genetic research and ancient genetic research to make our interpretations more accurate. We'll still get results, but they're more accurate if we're using the appropriate populations. So what this approach does is allow us to, begin to classify prints into one of 6 categories with greater accuracy. Adult males and females, adult and adolescent males and females, and we can certainly distinguish children, and we're beginning to try and really get at distinguishing male and female children as well. But there's one last thing we have to consider before interpreting prints, and I'll show you some. And this is the biggest trick, is the objects that we're dealing with are made of clay, and when clay dries and it's fired, it shrinks as water evaporates from the clay body. So this means the ridges that we're looking at are narrower and more dense than they were when they were originally impressed. So ridge breadth decreases with shrinkage. So age will be underestimated. Ridge density increases with shrinkage. So our sex determination will be skewed towards females if we don't consider how much these objects shrunk. So to combat this, we do a ton of experimentation with clay shrinkage rates and all of this type of stuff to express results at kind of a minimum amount of shrinkage and probably the maximum amount of shrinkage that this clay would have shrunk, because every time we add stuff to clay, and potters have added virtually anything you can think of to clay to control this process, that will simply just decrease the amount of shrinkage you have. So this is a technical thing, it's a technical consideration, but if you don't do this, you are just so wrong. You're going to be incredibly wrong, and all your results are just going to be a mess because you need to consider this technical factor. So once we do that, then we're in shape and we can start taking a look at fun prints. So in my lab, we've been looking at pottery with print impressions over the last few years from 4 major regions, and we're packing those in and still elaborating them on them. The first is from Britain. We've been taking a look at stuff from Central Europe, the ancient Levant in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in Central Canada as well. And so what I'll do is I'll start with the oldest of these and then I'll move through them to the most historically recent. And I will skip the work, which is probably really interesting to everyone, that's being done locally here on pre-contact indigenous ceramics, because it's the subject of one of my master's students' research. And I'm not gonna trump her stuff. She can talk about that. So the oldest sample that we're looking at comes from the Ness of Brodgar in Scotland, and it's situated at the crossroads from one side of the mainland of the Orkney Archipelago to the other. The Ness is a fascinating place because it exhibits this stunning record of a mixed farming society with new kinds of architecture. It's all stone-built architecture, amazing new painted pottery, elaborate ceremonial equipment like these polished mace heads and new forms of ceremonial and funerary monuments at about the same time that we see like the first stone, wood, and Stonehenges further to the south in Britain. So although we've only identified a handful of prints from some sherds from one of these Neolithic buildings that date to, the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, these results are wildly unexpected. What was surprising is that the prints were clearly male with no ambiguity whatsoever, and they were of adolescent or even younger age. The most recent print that we looked at, that we examined, was definitely male, but it looks to be a younger adolescent. So basically we're dealing with young men under the age of about 20 being the primary pottery makers in this culture, which is I can tell you something that I sure didn't expect. Now, more and more work gets done, maybe we'll change that. But right now, was not what we expected. Another place that we've been working at that dates just slightly later in time is coming from what are called the early Bronze 3 occupation of a place called Tel Asafi Gat in Israel, excavated by Haskell Greenfield and Aaron Mayer here. And this is an interesting place because it's a time of early urbanism. These are like the first cities and possibly the earliest states in the region. And we examine pottery from here that spans to a very short window of time in the big scheme of things, about 100 years long, from a residential neighborhood that was part of this city. This assemblage was fantastic because prints had excellent preservation, and we could actually distinguish a bunch of different ways that prints could be impressed on pottery that no one had bothered to talk about before, and how it would then subsequently survive for us to look at it. So in our study, you can see some, these are pretty, this is like 4 millimeters wide, right? So these are very, very tiny, but this is some of the spectacular kind of preservation that we get, almost entire prints here from one individual. And we get 2 full fingerprints, and this is on plaster here, and this is on the surface of the clay body, and sometimes we get entire hands, and this was a hand being placed inside the pot to stabilize it, probably when they were shaping the outside of it. So, but this stuff was brilliant because we were able to identify male and female prints, no doubt about it, mainly adults and adolescents of both sexes. What was interesting is the prints that we looked at were predominantly male, and there were many female suspected prints in this little overlap zone that we got. We only identified a few children's prints, maybe, and these were exclusively on handles, alongside adult or adolescent prints of men or women. So this pattern that we're looking at here is interesting because it suggests that men more often made vessels, but men and women were sometimes involved in making the same vessels together, and sometimes children helped out by putting little handles on the big storage jars, and then you have a couple other adult prints there alongside them that help them attach it. So this was really interesting stuff because we had never really seen multiple prints of different ages and sexes on the same pots. They were always one or the other, and so this was pretty fascinating. If we move again in time but stay in the same region, we've also been looking at prints from a place called Bet Shemesh. So we've been looking at figurines and a little crude lamp there from the back of a palace at Bet Shemesh, which was, at the time we're dealing with, a kind of a medium-sized city-state in a network of Canaanite city-states that are really pretty well understood from the 14th century BC. And at the time, these urban centers were largely under the dominance of Egypt. So there was an outside influence of Egypt in this region. The figurines and lamp that we're looking at are bizarre because they were actually found in a big ceramic barrel along with all of this stuff. And if you take a look at, if you find stuff like this, this is always associated with feasting. These are wares that you associated with feasting kind of celebrations. And we have all of these right in along with them. We have the 5 figurines in this crude looking little bowl. You can see from this, hopefully you can see it well enough. I mean, look at all the fingerprints on here. There's an astonishing almost 60 fingerprints in this small collection of objects here, all from the feasting room at the back of the palace, in which virtually nothing else was in that room except this feasting stuff and these figurines. So when we were looking at this, there was like no precedent at all for what we were going to find. And what we ended up seeing is something fantastic. is that the fingers of adults and adolescents and children of both sexes was on every single one of these objects. The fingers of men and women and teenagers and little kids was all over these things. Each of them touched them. And because these were associated with feasting, in a forthcoming paper is hopefully going to come out soon, we've been compelled to discuss why did these objects occur in a feasting room, and whether this distinction that archaeologists make between ritual objects and children's toys, why this might not apply at all in this case. We have no idea what these things really are, and so we need to really talk through this stuff. The last area that we've been looking at is Central Europe. I've been working with a couple of great people, archaeologists in Poland, who've been examining bronze casting molds from what have long been termed the metallurgist foundryman graves that are dating to some 3,000 to 2,500 years ago throughout Central Europe, but this particular group comes from Poland. It's part of the Urnfield culture, this big giant cultural group. And these molds are really interesting because they were used to make a variety of tools and jewelry, as well as ingots, which were used for transport or for use later on. These are always associated with men in male-only graves, and those graves often included adolescent males and male children as well. So it's long been thought that men were the makers of the molds, and they were also the makers of the bronze objects. So we were pretty interested to see what was coming out of this. Well, from these we have 8 really good measurable prints, and these primarily occur on the bottom, on the base, but we've got a few clear ones on the top as well. Regardless of where they're from, the molds have prints that belonged to adult or adolescent males exclusively. The jewelry mold, which is interesting, also has adult and adolescent prints, but there are also print impressions on the base made by a much younger prepubescent male, so the young male child. And this profile, this little demographic profile, is precisely the people that occur in the graves that go along with where these objects are found. So it's really quite fascinating. Now, I will end by saying that we absolutely know when we're counting all of these things, we do know that more prints does not equal more individuals, right? One individual can make many prints. But when you have a preponderance of one over another, maybe what we're looking at here is something that indicates the degree of engagement in manufacture, and that is a difference in the level of engagement that is probably differing between males and females and people of different ages. So at this stage, I think we can probably throw out some hypotheses to shake the tree of archaeologists, and we can say, we can propose that, in Urnfield culture, this is really tightening up with other kinds of evidence. And exclusively, we have male adults and adolescents, probably children, were involved sometimes in making these molds. That fits with what we know about the other technologies and the graves. We can perhaps say that both sexes and all ages were making figurines at the Canaanite city of Bet Shemesh, certainly, and probably in other places as well in this network of city-states. If we move further back in time, in northern Britain, we exclusively have male potters in early farming societies in northern Britain. And if we look at Tel Asafi, well, we have a different pattern altogether. We have predominantly male adult and adolescent potters there in these early Levantine city-states, but men and women and children often would work together. So these results are interesting because they really challenge some assumptions that males and females are exclusively potters in all past societies. It challenges our ethnographic assumption where we would expect women to be potters in all past societies, that ancient behavioral pattern. And the presence of multiple prints of different ages really opens up the possibility for us to begin to understand teaching and learning crafts, transferring that knowledge from one generation to the next, or even across groups of people who are practicing the craft. We still face a really, really big problem though. One problem that is not solved yet is really securely identifying males and females. And females may well be underrepresented in terms of their involvement in the different steps and stages of manufacturing these things. There's simply not enough reference studies that are out there that are undertaken in a way that would be informative to the study of prints on archaeological objects, and that's something that we need to work on and change. I think another problem that we have here is, and you'll probably have noticed it, is that we really need to make the transition from knowing something about the sex of past individuals to a really fruitful discussion of gender. And that is something that's going to require more than I can give from this kind of evidence. But I think it's something that we can talk about in the future, and that might have to wait for another time. So with that, I thank you all very much for showing up. I'm a great many people involved in this project from many parts of the world. I thank them all.